Barcelona és una ciutat amb molta història. Una ciutat que ha crescut fins on ha pogut, ja que està limitada per una muntanya, un mar i 2 rius. L'espai per viure s'ha convertit en un bé preuat i hi ha qui ho ha aprofitat per fer negoci. En aquest escenari tan complicat també hi neixen les idees més esperançadores per aconseguir que l'habitatge sigui un dret real. Les vols venir a conèixer?
Hola, bon dia. Good morning. Welcome to the second day of the European Network for Housing Research Conference 2022. I hope you've had time to enjoy not only the conference, but the city as well. Had you ever been here before, or is it the first time you visit Barcelona? First time? Anybody? Okay, that's nice. So I know as a local I might be biased, but I hope you have time to wander around and go through different neighborhoods, because I genuinely think that Barcelona is one of the most beautiful and one of the best places in the world to live in. Its essence, beauty, identity, and culture stem from the balance between the past and the future, a dialogue between historical and contemporary movements and creations, between tradition and innovation. We know where we come from, and we're proud of that, but we're also eager to look ahead and move forward towards a more sustainable, healthier, fairer, and safer city for everyone. And a remarkable proof of that is Superilla Barcelona Urban Plan. Had you heard of it? Yeah? Does that remind you about anything? Have you seen it? It's one of the main transformation projects promoted by the City Council to reverse the impact of climate emergency and pollution in the city, and also to favor neighborhood life and soft and active mobility through qualitative, inclusive, and green public spaces for people and also non-human species. Let's not forget about that, the need to think about interspecies cities. In fact, I was honored to be a member of the Superilla Barcelona Advisory Board, because I honestly think that these ideas and actions are extremely relevant and urgent following the local and global challenges we're already facing. And as you know, one of these projects, Superilla Barcelona, in the neighborhood of San Antonio, which is a really nice neighborhood, will be one of today's field trips. So if you've signed up for it, you will be able to see it with your own eyes and learn more about this project. And I know that you're also going to feel amazed with the rest of the field trips. And I will explain more about this just in a sec. But first, let me share some practical information with you. So today there will be this third plenary session. We will talk about it later. And also 2 workshops, one after the coffee break and the other one just after lunch at 2 p.m. After that, as I mentioned, you will be able to attend some of the field trips that will take place from 5 to 6:30 p.m. more or less. And you can go there straight away from here. So you have all the information on the website. You will find how to get there, and you can use your public transportation ticket, T-Casual, okay? Just let me give you some information about each of these field trips. I know most of you have chosen and have signed up for one of it, but you still have time to sign up for some of them if you haven't done it yet. So field trip number 1 is the transformation of Plaza de las Glorias. I don't know if you know this place. It used to be a road junction, like in the outskirts of the city, a no man's land, but now it's a green public space with public facilities and public housing, and it's really interesting. I still remember we were here a few years ago discussing this project, and it was a huge project for the future of the city. It was crowded, it was so powerful and passionate because it was a big deal. So I think you're gonna enjoy it if you go there. There's also field trip number 2, the public and cooperative housing in La Marina del Prat Vermell. They tell me that it's already booked. So the ones who are going there, you know what it is about. It's public and cooperative housing, one of the fastest growing areas in Barcelona. Also, we have field trip number 3, the urban transformation at 22 Ad Innovation District. Such a great place to visit, not only 22 22 but also Poblenou. And field trip number 4, as I was saying, Superilla, Barcelona, in Sant Antoni. And after that, you will have the dinner at 8 p.m. We will meet for dinner in a very special place, Sessió de França, where we will announce the winner of the Bank Turner Award and also the city that will host next year's conference. And of course, you will enjoy some lovely live music and food. So bring your ticket, your dinner ticket, and let's meet there to enjoy not only the conference, but also something else. And having said that, let's continue with the conference, because yesterday we talked about the right to housing and the right to the city. We discussed how housing is addressing its financial situation and also the notions of reform and recovery. And inevitably, those questions concern rental prices, the topic of the third plenary session, putting rent under control, models, evidence, and debate. Given the huge increase in rents, as you know, some European capitals are opting for this now kind of classic and yet no less controversial solution, which is temporary measures to control rental prices. The debate is taking place at different scales, from policymaking to theoretical reflections. So it is key for us to discuss these measures from different points of view and in the light of provisional solutions. In order to do so, today we will count on Christine Whitehead, Emeritus Professor in Housing Economics at the London School of Economics and Director of the Cambridge Centre for Housing and Planning Research from 1990 to 2010, who will join us online. Also, Marco Peverini, PhD candidate in Urban Planning, Design and Policy at Politecnico di Milano, who deals with housing and urban policies with reference to affordable housing. A.Kholodilin, researcher of the Macroeconomics Department at DIY Berlin, the German Institute for Economic Research, currently working on housing markets and big data. And the session will be moderated by Montse Pareja-Eastaway, PhD in Economics and Vice Chair of the European Network for Housing Research. So now you can join us on stage, and let's greet them with a round of applause to start the day.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all again. Thank you, Nuria, for the presentation. So I think that we have a very interesting topic today, as many others during the conference. That was especially chosen as some of the things that has been going on in Barcelona and in other cities. A lot of debate, academic debate, political debate, even, let's say, societal debate, right? We thought that we couldn't go for a conference without a plenary on this particular topic, which is of huge concern, because not the rent control itself, but the reasons why rent control has become a possible, maybe provisional measure in large capitals, in big capitals in Europe. So, as Nuria said already, we do have 3 wonderful speakers from different parts of the world, all of them experts on the topic. And it is my pleasure to welcome Christine Whitehead. She's at home, but she's in our heart, at least in mine. And I am so happy that she accepted to participate in this plenary session for many reasons, because she's a part of the heart of the ENHR, but also because she has a very interesting approach to this particular policy measure. So I think that I won't use more time. I welcome and I say hello to Christine. Hello, Christine. The floor is yours whenever you want. I think that you are mute, Christine. You need to unmute yourself, maybe.
As always.
Wonderful.
Right. Thank you very, very much for the invitation and for your kind introduction. I'm very sorry not to be there in person. What on earth are you doing eating at 8 o'clock in the evening? In Barcelona, one's always much later than that, as far as I was concerned. Maybe the world has changed. I also wanted to say very quickly that I'm missing seeing you all, but I'm also, of course, missing my colleague Judy Yates, who I knew for 40-odd years and who came to ENHR very regularly from Australia, who died in May, and we will miss her enormously. And our knowledge of Australia will unhappily go down just as they're becoming a more liberal society again. So to turn to the topic in hand, my presentation is very descriptive because one of the things about the current environment is that nobody seems to know very much history, so I thought I'd just run through from 1916, quite a long while ago. So moving on to the actual presentation, if you can move the slides. Basically in Europe, not the case elsewhere always, rent control was introduced mainly in 1915 and 1916 because people were moving around the country as part of the war effort, and people were extremely cross about how rapidly rents were rising. So it was a political necessity to bring in some form of control, perhaps as it is today. The type of control which was introduced is the one which economists hate, of first generation. It is to say the rents were set at either the current rate or more normally the 1914 rate, so before the war, and they were fixed. And they were fixed for a very long time in some cases. And the controls were normally nationwide, although some countries did pick out the areas which were particularly affected. And it was important that it was seen as being temporary, and I heard Montse say something implicit about temporary. Rent controls are always seen as being temporary. They very rarely are. They were extended as the shortages after the war worsened, and the situation in terms of housing got worse in the early 20s. There was some reduction in controls in the 1930s, but then, of course, we went back to war and we went back to controls absolutely immediately. And just to take an example, in the UK, some of the elements of that 1939 control remained in place until 1989. And it was really a long while before markets returned to a market, hopefully very different from a market before 1914. And of course, the results of this longer term rent control are very well documented. Housing standards went down. Under occupancy was a massive problem because households get smaller, but they couldn't move. There were transfers out of the sector of a lot of properties, or they were knocked down. And new build happened in other sectors. So moving on. After 1945, took a while before anything changed because quantitative shortages in housing. The number of dwellings was smaller than the number of households until the 1970s in most Western European countries. It was only when that quantitative shortage was overcome that we started to see decontrol. And some countries moved by the turn of the century to a situation with almost no controls. England was one of them, Finland and Norway were two others. But some other countries, notably the Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden, retained fundamentally the system that they had in 1980, which was decontrolled as compared to earlier, until now. And we're looking at it again now. But what I think is interesting is that we did a research project in 2010. And I took out the diagram because all it showed was reductions in control. And when we wrote that report in 2010, there was almost no discussion of rent control. Moving on. What there was, of course, was rent regulation. And most European countries, Western European countries, had a system of unlimited security of tenure for the tenant and versions of third or second generation rent control. Second generation meaning that there was an index to control rents both within a tenancy and if you would change tenants. But the third generation, much more normal, that market rents were set and then they were stabilized through an index while the tenancy remained. England, of course, stands out as being without such controls and with particularly short-term tenancies. So tenants have 6 to 12 months security. Scotland, on the other hand, has gone against this and now has moved to the European model of unlimited security of tenure. The countries with relatively stable regulatory systems, Netherlands, Germany, tend to have larger private rented sectors. But these countries also have often, not always, stronger constraints on entry, and getting into owner occupation may be more difficult, getting into social renting may be more difficult. So the controls go with the fact that more people, more types of people are in the private rented sector. And some have two-level systems, and a lot leave out new build. Moving on again. And just to move on once more to the diagram, to the table, it's important that private renting has been increasing very significantly in some countries and increasing almost in all countries, except, of course, as always, Germany and Ireland, where rent controls began to be introduced in 2016. And Belgium is just about even-handed. Going back, just to be awkward, this is because it's much more difficult to get into owner occupation, partly because of house price increases, partly because of other regulations. Some countries have a reduction in social rented housing as well. So private renting is for residual tenure nowadays, and it is therefore growing. And of course, private rents have been rising very rapidly in some areas, particularly interestingly after COVID. And I think most economists are really surprised by what is going on in the private rented sector at the present time in many of the countries we're talking about. There's also been, and I think you may have talked a little bit about this yesterday, new large-scale participants in the market, mostly institutional investors, so sometimes local, initially local, but often now international, who are looking, at least initially, for a secure return in a world in which interest rates have become very low. Some of these investors have been very positive and wanting to increase the supply of housing overall with build-to-rent accommodation. But this is mainly for middle-income households, so it doesn't help the poorer end of the market. And most of these more traditional institutional landlords are perfectly happy to have a stable growth in rents defined by someone else and long-term security of tenure. But some, and of course Blackstone is always the example quoted, international private equity investors in the main are looking much more for the potential for short-term gains because rents can be increased, notably with renovation. So moving on to, of course, the particular pressures are the growth in institutional investors have raised widespread concerns about the move from housing as a home to housing as a tradable asset, rather, and especially the consequences of this for lower income households. This, of course, is what we mean by financialization, which I think you were talking about yesterday. It seemed to be a major reason for rising rents and gentrification in many European cities. In practice, direct impacts are really quite small, but indirect impacts are large, and in one or two areas, they are very, very significant indeed. A particularly important issue, which I'm sure you did talk about, was renovictions. Just to say that many of the countries who have got rent regulation in place have the right to raise rents if you do improvements. So they don't have to ask the tenant to do if they can do the improvement, or they didn't have to, and therefore they are able to do energy efficiency and other types of renovation, some of them good, some of them not really necessary, and push up the rents enormously so that the existing tenants can't afford those rents. And so we move into the gentrification story. And this has become highly political, but it's become highly political in the last 10 years. And most of the evidence of increasing rent control has happened since 2014. One reason they're on the agenda is they're enormously popular with people. In London, where there's no possibility for London to do anything about it, 65% of Londoners would like to see a much stronger rent control regime. And that will be replicated across Europe. Most of them have concentrated not on doing national systems, but by concentrating on stress areas and giving regional and local government control over how rents are determined. But it's also the case that there has been a tendency for this stress areas to be expanded to fundamentally non-stress areas. So, for instance, in Ireland, and I think in Germany as well. Many, as I say, is at regional city level, but it's the national government that sets the framework. Although that has been an issue, obviously, in Berlin, it's been an issue in one or two other cities who have tried to do things, such as Barcelona, which are out of line with what the national government has wanted. The supply of tenants is declining for other reasons, notably the growth of short-term lettings, particularly in cities which have a large tourist population. And of course, welfare systems have become less generous, so the problems of paying for these rents have become much worse for the bottom end of the market. And of course, I think much more importantly, at some level, underlyingly, the distribution of income has got vastly worse over the last 20 years. And that's increasing the numbers, finding it difficult to pay the rent. Moving on to examples, we'll probably come back to these in discussion. I think many of you will know the details, or even later. Germany has had third-generation rent control, in the economist term, for decades. But from 2013, they introduced certain additional controls in stress areas across the country. And then, of course, Berlin tried to bring in a much tougher form of first-generation rent control, which they were ruled out by government. France has taken a while to, in Paris started to do things. 28 agglomerations have been identified, but by no means all of them have yet brought it in. Ireland is a very interesting one. Was highly deregulated, even more than England, and then moved to this system of in line with market rents, and then to pressure zones. And these pressure zones are now covering a very large proportion of the urban system in Ireland. And of course, Spain, which I won't talk about because so many other people know so much more than I do. But we do now have a national government right to housing law, which will potentially give regions not the powers that they wanted, but some powers. And notably, the Netherlands, going for a very much a national approach, have simply raised the barrier, the point at which free market rents can be set. So a larger proportion of the private rented sector has now got rent controls. Moving on very quickly. So far, it hasn't really impacted very much on investors' behaviour. Partly that may be because some of the extreme constraints haven't been brought in, but partly it's because tenants haven't actually responded by trying to make sure their rents are brought down, and the data which is being used to introduce and work the regulatory system is not yet fully in place. But anyway, most of the negative aspects of rent control on the supply and housing quality wouldn't be expected to show up this quickly. It will probably be 10 years before there will be very significant impacts. So the temporary nature of rent controls is something we should think about. Very quickly, because I suspect I'm over time, Western European countries use a third-generation rent stabilization system, which has worked pretty well until the tensions of the last few years, which have become really very difficult to address. There's been a lot of exceptions, which those exceptions have made it easier to maintain the rent stabilization system, but they've also left vulnerable households being kicked out in many cases. And the environment in the last 10, now in the last 5 years, has changed totally. In 2010, you wouldn't have imagined that we would be where we are in 2022. And where we'll be in 2025, I have no idea. But it is fair to say that the policies are more sophisticated than 1916, though not as sophisticated as would be helpful. And there's very considerable concerns about uncertainties and unintended consequences. And there's also, I think most importantly, very considerable concerns that while rent control may work in what is regarded as the sort of formal and well-behaved part of the market, the significant part of the market which is not like that will almost certainly not be significantly affected by legal change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christine.
Leave Marco and Constantine to talk about the real detail.
Thank you very much, Christine. Wonderful framework to somehow put everybody in the room at the same level. Now we know what's going on in Europe, at least in terms of rent control. It is my pleasure now to welcome again Marco Peverini. And I just want to remind you that it would be wonderful to have just a presentation of 15-20 minutes, right? So it will come. Yeah.
So, good morning to everybody. Of course, it's an honor to be here, participate to this plenary. Just a small correction, I finished my PhD recently, in July.
Good.
And the PhD was in urban planning and policy analysis. at the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies of Politecnico di Milano, and so I will present a perspective that is more focused on the planning side of the aspect and arguing somehow that rental housing policies need also solid foundations from the land and planning side. So it was already discussed how rent control is a measure that involves state interventions into the dynamics of the rental market to guarantee some levels of rental housing affordability and some rental stability to households, and that after a long-standing debate mainly polarized between supply and control arguments, liberalization has been favored in the 20th century, and we are now discussing it again. So my argument starts from the point made by some economists that basically the current housing affordability crisis is driven much more than before by the land component. So the capitalization of the land rent that actually drives up housing prices shapes now affordability problems and makes them much more pressing and urgent in a different way than before, affecting much more attractive and successful cities in a way than widespread in the territory. So today it's worth exploring this theme again in the framework of the contemporary forms of public interventions into housing problems. So starting from the point that actually land component is the main one into housing prices, and also noticing from the literature that there has been a rupture into urban studies in general of the land rent argument, and that actually rehabilitating the land rent argument is a central point for having a more contemporary debate. I try to look at the point by merging the literature on land rent theory and focusing on planning instruments and land policies. Urban land rent represents the objectivation in terms of price of the value that economic actors attribute to spatial situations, such as being in a certain place in a certain city. And we know from long history of academic literature that actually land rent is transferred to housing prices, mainly through capitalization of it in the process of development, such as in new expansions, or through the valorization of the so-called rent gap, as theorized by Neil Smith, in the process of gentrification of existing built environments. So starting from these points, many scholars have made the point that actually the public action and governance has a role in actually dealing with these dynamics. So basically, I mentioned the work of Hanaila and Eric Clark, who is very explicit, for example, in saying that good urban governance means making rent gap theory not true. In a way, just to state in a very strong way how actually the state is shaping also the land rent dynamics on its own, and not only the market. So in a way, adopting the conceptual framework by Neil Smith, whenever land rent values are rising, such as in successful cities like the one we're in, and depreciation in some way happens, for example, in the built environment or in unused land assets, some scenarios are possible, while, let's say, the theoretical better market outcome would be the full valorization of land rent, so the so-called highest and best use. Somehow something different can happen. If nothing happens, decadence would come up at some point, but also intermediate stages are possible, and are the ones that I argue would be more favorable in terms of socio-political objectives of maintaining affordability levels in a moment, or better, in a situation in which incomes are actually stagnating. So coherence in this sense. So to go on, I will present two small case studies I did during the PhD by looking at local housing systems. So basically looking at how in two cities with land rent rise, with affordability problems, or with potential affordability problem, rental housing affordability was actually governed. And I looked at three main policy domains, so housing policies, spatial planning, and social policies, within a complex multi-level arrangement, which of course embeds local government within different levels that encompass regional and national ones. So just to frame the situation, rental regulation usually, as we saw, has been a competence of national states, while land policies within constraints that are given at national and international legislation are actually more in power of municipal governments usually. So this is an interesting issue already to discuss. Let's go to the two cases I will try to present. They're taken from the thesis. The first one is the city of Milan, in which I live and work. So the city of Milan has had a history of big economic development. So it's the economic capital of Italy, basically, and has been facing a strong demographic pressure. During the post-war era, basically the governance of rental housing was based on a very powerful land policy tool, which involved compulsory land purchase from the municipality to be devoted to public and affordable rental housing, which involved many sites in the periphery, which were only part of it were actually devoted to housing construction, which was flanked by full rent control on the whole rental sector, which was labeled fair rent and made rents basically be calculated with objective indicators and parameters. However, after the 1980s, more or less, no more land policies was enacted, and actually rent control in the 90s was erased completely. So no more rent control in any part of the sector. What has happened since then is that the rental stock, which accounts for 30% of the total households in Milan, more or less, has been increasingly polarized between almost around 2/3 of full market rental housing, mainly owned by small landlords, and a big portion, which is around 1/3, of public housing, which is owned by municipalities or regions. And since the time, with a small controversial intermediate sector, which is not really rent controlled, rent control only applies to the public housing sector, actually, in which rents are calculated, first of all, through the fair rent objective parameters, but then adjusted to the incomes of tenants, which are usually very low. So in fact, it is not a rent control, but it is an income-related rent. Lately, in the last decades, basically nothing happened in the domain of rent control, plus land policies have actually shifted their objectives from public and affordable housing construction to actually providing revenues for the municipality. So public land assets, such as former office buildings or unused public parking lots and so on, are actually sold with an auction system with limited, actually, inclusionary zoning requirements of rent-controlled segments. So, to sum up Milan, we passed in around 50 years from a land regime, as Hannah would say, that was more towards the middle of the spectrum, with a lot of effort to maintain coherence with incomes through compulsory land purchase, public housing construction, and rent control, to a kind of polarized land regime which has liberalization of the private rental sector and therefore gentrification and so on, as was already described, plus this total sale of public housing, public land asset and public housing units. And on the contrary, a trend toward the decadence of the unsold public housing stock, where rents are so low that are actually not even able to sustain the sector. Going fast to the second case, maybe most of you know know it quite well. So also Vienna, the capital of Austria, of course, has been also a city with a lot of pressure on the housing market. And has undergone a partial deregulation of the rental or the private rental sector, driven by changes in the national legislation, but on the contrary, has had a strengthening regime of land policies targeting housing affordability in general, which were carried out continuously since the 1920s through a system of land banking by the municipality, which curiously was actually made possible initially by the application of rent control and by the consequent drop in the market prices of land, and that has, however, continued by the time, making the city able to actually shape the rental housing market almost everywhere in the city, and providing a big sector, a big supply of what we could say actually it's a rent-controlled segment, thanks to a national framework of a national legislation which actually limits rents within certain sectors of the rental housing system to cost rent level, which is after the repayment of the initial investment, even as it was showed by the Housing Europe report, even drops to a level which is comparable to a second-generation rent control, theoretically permanently, so theoretically eternally in a way. So in this way, the rental sector in Vienna, which is much more majoritarian than in Milan, accounts for a diversity of rental tenures, in which the majority is actually rent-controlled, not only in the private sector, but also mostly in the public and affordable sector, so-called. One remark is that the social housing supply, also in Vienna, is differently from Milan, is no demand-side measure, since rents are not actually attached to incomes, as in the Italian public housing sector, but are cost rent. And actually, there is a crucial apart from social policies of income support and housing allowances to actually maintain this coherence. So in a way, I can conclude by saying that actually the land regime in Vienna is much more targeted toward the intermediate parts of the spectrum, which are those that I argue are more socio-politically favorable in terms of maintaining housing affordability levels. So to conclude, or better to summarize, in a situation of partial total liberalization of rent control in the private rental sector, active land policies had a pivotal role in redistributing land rent by providing a decommodified rent control rental stock. It's repeated, sorry. However, the shift in the land regime in Milan, so the end of this compulsory land purchase and the sale of the public land assets through auctions prevented the diversification of the rental stock, while on the contrary, active land policies remained pivotal between housing objectives, affordability objectives, and spatial planning in the Viennese regime, allowing for a large decommodification of the rental stock. But also, we have to note the different role of the link between housing and social policies in the two regimes, where actually public housing in Italy is having a role of actual welfare service in a way by actually reducing housing costs to an income affordable level, theoretically, while this is not the case in Vienna, which is a cost rent system, in which, however, social policies are much more relevant. So, to conclude, my argument would be that rental housing policies overall in local housing systems need solid foundations, which, the combination of an effective land regime for the redistribution of land rent with a clear regulative framework for rent setting in the decommodified stock, which can do the job of creating a permanently rent-controlled and decommodified stock, but also a well-structured connection with social policies, as long as incomes are the other side of the problem, and actually creating for example, cost rent system as Vienna has done, leaves some space that should be covered by demand-side measure. So in a general context of the evolution of housing welfare policies to the local level, these are useful, I think, insights to maintain rental housing affordability levels. The challenge, I would argue, is how to actually shape land regime within the built stock, and this is something I have no answer to, but I would like to mention the fact that in an Italian city, a medium city actually recently, a local administration has been buying for a failed real estate operation, and the officer said, we are setting up a public housing plan within a built complex, within a built asset. So I think this is the direction we should be going towards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, may I remind the audience that we don't have a Slido because we are not as modern as Ivan Tosic, but please take your notes and keep in mind your questions, because I think that we will have time for a really fruitful discussion after our last presentation by Konstantin A.Kholodilin. Please.
So I'm very glad to be here and to share with you some results of our joint research made by Fernando Lopez, David Rey Blanco, and Pelayo González Arbues, and of course me. So since we're in Catalonia, the talk will be about rent control introduced in Catalonia a couple of years ago. So, of course, before you have rent control, you need a trigger, and typically the trigger is the deterioration in the housing affordability. And that's what we heard already today, and many of you who live in this city perfectly know it from your own experience. So, here in the picture, I just showed several the indicator of rental burden, which is housing expenditure divided by income in a couple of Catalonian cities. And you see that in some cities, especially in Barcelona and 3 cities around of it, the rental burden is above 30%, which is considered to be a threshold of affordability. And then, if it wasn't enough, Corona came, and with it came an economic crisis, incomes went down, and therefore the housing affordability deteriorated even more. And of course, the government reacted to this. So we know that in Spain there was a rent moratorium introduced in spring 2020, and actually, if I'm correct, they prolonged it until December of this year. So quite a long-playing policy. And then in Catalonia, they undertook several attempts. The first one was in 2019, but it failed very quickly. And then a more long-living attempt was introduced in September 2020 with rent control that lasted until April of this year, when it was revoked by Constitutional Court, as Professor Whitehead told us already about. So what I want to say is that this policy that you had here, rent control, belongs to a family. Now it's a growing family, which we can denote as rental break, using the title of German law, Mietpreisbremse, that was introduced in 2015. And then in 2018, France followed with its Loi Elan. Then 2020, it was the turn of Catalonia to join the group. As far as I know, Brussels introduced something similar, but this policy is not active yet. And we can find some similarities in Ireland and Scotland with the rent pressure zones also mentioned by Whitehead. So these 3 laws, they have certain similarities and certain differences. I will just briefly talk about them. First of all, the duration. Both in Germany and in France, they introduced this law for 5 years. But as Professor Whitehead already mentioned, rent control is always a provisionary measure that lasts for decades. So in Germany, it was prolonged for 5 years in 2020, and I have all security that it will be prolonged in 2025 for another 5 years. In France, we don't know yet, but probably in 2023, they will prolong it again. Catalonians were smarter because they, from the very beginning, didn't set any ending date for their control. Now, in all these policies, we have rent control which doesn't cover the whole country, but just concentrates on certain areas. These are the tight housing areas. There are always different criteria that determine that the area is having tight housing market. Interestingly, however, is that both in Germany and in France, the proportion of population living in these regulated areas is relatively small. So it's from 7 to, in France, to 25% of population. While in Catalonia, it was more than 68% of population, concentrated in just 60 municipalities that were subject to rent control, out of about 1,000 municipalities. Now, exceptions. Typically, you have exceptions from rent control. In this case, in Germany and Catalonia, it's newly built housing and largely renovated housing. They were accepted from rent control. In France, there were no exceptions, and in Catalonia, I should say that these exceptions were rather fictitious because, in fact, they were to last for 5 years. After that period, the newly built housing was subject to rent control, but even during these first 5 years, they were also subject to rent control, although less strict than not accepted dwellings. And there's also an interesting exception in Catalonia that big dwellings, those exceeding whose floor area exceeds 150 meters, they are also exempted from the regulation. And the last two things, the key part of any rent control is the reference rent. So you first want to set rent, especially in the first generation rent control. You set rent at a certain level using certain criteria, and then you say which are the allowed rents. So in this case, the rents are based on the characteristics of this reference-based. Reference rents are based on the characteristics of dwellings, both structural and locational. They are computed in a different way, but the principle is the same. And then the actual rent can exceed the reference rent, but just by a certain amount. In Germany, just 10%. In France, 20%. And in Catalonia, 5%. So the strictest from all these regulations. Okay, that was an interesting novelty. I mean, the introduction of rent control after so many years without rent control. So I think in 1984, the last rent control was demolished in Spain. So after these 40 years without rent control, it was an interesting novelty. So it attracted I should say, a lot of research attention, because already 2 months, well, half a year after the end of rent control, we have at least 3 papers investigating the effects of rent control in Catalonia. So 2 of them are here, Monras and Montalvo, Geoffrey, Monseigne, and others. So these are 2 papers on the effects of rent control in Catalonia. And this already shows that this topic is quite interesting. So they arrived to quite similar conclusions. When they look at the rental price effects, they figure out that there was a decrease in rent prices after introduction of rent control by 5 to 6%. In terms of supply effects, or in terms of the number of dwellings for rent, in the first study they find a decrease in supply by 10 to 14%. In the second study, they don't find any effect of it. Until now, this fits quite well into the literature on empirical literature on rent control effects. Now, the third study on rent control in Catalonia is our study. And here I'd like to show you some differences in data between our study and the first 2 studies. So unlike the study of Monraz, Montalvo, Geoffrey Monseigne, and others, who used Incasol data. Incasol is an institution in Catalonia that actually computes the reference prices. So they have a huge amount of data on transaction rents, and that's a very useful source of information. So in contrast to them, we'd use the data from Idealista. You know, it's an internet portal where you can sell or rent out dwellings and other real estate. So we use asking prices. So you may say that the transaction prices are better than asking prices, but, well, it's a disputable question. The period the sample period that we use interlapse to some extent. They start 1 year earlier and end their sample 1 year earlier too. We use the data from January 2017 to May 2022, and that allows us to look also at the effects of revocation of rent control. So not only the introduction, but also revocation. What happened after rent control was removed? Our data set has more locational and structural characteristics. The sample size is similar. It's about 500,000 of observations. And another big advantage of our data is that they include not only rental prices, but also dwellings for sale. Not only rental dwellings, but also dwellings for sale, because these two markets are, of course, closely interrelated. And now I can come to the estimation technique and then finally to the results. So in all these three studies, we're using the approach which is called difference in differences. It's a quite popular technique, especially in the last decade. And I think it's borrowed from the medical studies, from the clinical studies, because the idea here is that we have two groups, the treatment group and control group. And ideally, these groups have to contain identical elements, so in this case, dwellings. And the only difference that is allowed for is the difference in the treatment group, mainly that the treated dwellings are subject to some treatment, in this case, to rent control. Okay? So, but in real life, it's difficult to guarantee that the elements be identical, especially in the housing market. So what the previous two studies did, they used the geographical variation. As you can see here, the red areas are the areas, the 60 municipalities that are subject to rent control. So you see in the middle, on the seashore, Barcelona, in the south, Tarragona, in the east, in the west, Lleida, and so on. But you see that it's these red areas are located in the sea of gray areas, which are the areas that are not subject to rent control. So the first two studies, they included into the control group the red areas and into the, into the treatment group. And in the control group, they included the gray areas. I followed this idea too, but in addition, what I did, I considered only those non-control areas that are sharing common border with control areas. Okay, so in order to minimize the difference, at least in their locational characteristics. Plus, in contrast to the previous two studies, we can analyze both rent control introduction and rent control revocation effects. And I also explicitly model COVID effects, because I already mentioned that in the spring 2020, the Spanish government introduced its own rent control, plus COVID, of course, had a certain impact on the housing market. We show that it affected the rental prices and purchase prices negatively, statistically significant. So here, to model it, to take it into account, I'm using the stringency index of Oxford University. Maybe some of you know this index. It measures the different, summarize different measures, for example, lockdowns, quarantines, whatever, school closures, and so on and so forth. So, in fact, this measure correlates quite well with the mobility of population. Okay, so far the design, and now we can look at just throw a glance at the treatment and control group. So as I said, ideally, the elements must be identical. Is it really so? So this is a radar diagram. So the rays here, the axis here, they denote different characteristics of these dwellings. The red line is the average for the controlled municipalities, the dark gray for non-controlled but neighbor municipalities, and the light gray, I don't know if you can see it, especially from the back. These are non-controlled municipalities that are not neighbors of controlled ones. What we can see here is that the controlled dwellings are more expensive. They are older. They are located much closer to the city center of Barcelona, in this case, Plaça Catalonia. And they are also located in municipalities with much higher population density and in bigger buildings. There are more floors in these buildings and more apartments in these buildings. And the dark gray line, unfortunately, is still far away from this red line. It's a bit closer than the light gray area, but still there are big differences between controlled and treatment dwellings. However, we hope that this can be solved by using hedonic approach that takes into account these differences in characteristics. Plus, one idea is to use this provision in the law that says that the dwellings that have a floor area of more than 150 square meters, they can be exempted from the regulation. So ideally, we can also compare the somewhat smaller dwellings with the big dwellings in the controlled areas, and in this way, the assumptions of differences approach would be met. But I will not talk about this here. I will just concentrate it on the definition of treatment and control areas that I introduced here. So here I'm coming to results. Just 2 slides are left. So here the first 2 columns, or I should say the second and third columns, they contain the effects that I expected based on common sense and on economic theory. You see here that we have 2 market segments. So we have, in the upper part, we have rental dwellings. In the lower part, we have dwellings for sale. And then we have regulated rental dwellings, unregulated rental dwellings, and we have introduction and revocation of rent control. So lots of different information. So what I expected and what economic theory expects and practice expects is that upon introduction of rent control, we have decline in prices of regulated dwellings and their supply goes down. That's what we also found for Berlin after it introduced rent freeze in 2022. For unregulated dwellings, we would expect just the opposite. And yeah, in case of revocation, we would expect that the prices will start to grow again and that supply will restore. In case of dwellings for sale, the effects are somewhat different. So we expected, for example, that supply of dwellings for sale would increase because of conversion. So whenever the landlord faces the falling rental yield, he or she are selling the dwellings as condominiums. So what we found in reality? So the price effect is for regulated dwellings upon introduction was -6 to 7, depending on the way we define the control group. And it's very similar to what our Catalonian colleagues found, so 5 to 6%, -5 to -6%. In case of supply of dwellings, we didn't find any effect. It's similar to Geoffrey and Monseigne paper. After revocation, indeed, the prices increased, the rental prices, but very little. Nothing happened to the supply of dwellings. In case of unregulated dwellings, we find, after introduction of rent control, we'll find either no effects or weak negative effects. But interestingly, after revocation, there's a huge increase in rental prices for unregulated dwellings. Pretty unexpected. Again, no effect in terms of supply. More interesting, well, not more interestingly, but also interesting, if we look at the dwellings for sale, here we see that supply increased dramatically after introduction of rent control and after its revocation. So indeed, we have here this conversion effect. So they, instead of renting apartments, probably landlords started to sell them. And for unregulated dwellings for sale, we don't find any supply effects and relatively small and positive price effects. Okay. And the last thing was to look at the construction. Well, Professor Whitehead told us that, of course, it's something that takes a lot of time before we see any effects of rent control on housing stock. Still, I try to see if we can squeeze some information, can extract some information from the data. So here I use different information. These are the monthly averages of housing starts. The data are monthly, and they are available at national, regional, and provincial level. In Catalonia, you have 4 provinces. So I look here at Spain as a total, at Comunidad de Madrid, which is a kind of analog to province of Barcelona, and to Catalonia as an autonomous community. And I take the period prior, immediately before the introduction of rent control, so the 2 years before it, and during rent control. So what we see, it's not a proof, it's just some finding. It's not tested, but just some food for thought, if you wish. So if we look at what happened, so the 7,000, I think it's, 7,000 housing starts in Spain before the introduction of rent control went up to 8,000 plus after the rent control. Of course, Spain as a whole didn't have rent control, neither Comunidad de Madrid had any rent control. So in this case, we observe increase in the housing starts by 12 to 13%, okay? In case of Catalonia, we have a decline of 6%. In case of Barcelona, province of Barcelona, which includes both regulated and unregulated areas, we have a decline of 7%. So it may, apart from this, both Spain, both Comunidad de Madrid and Catalonia, they were subject to more or less the same shocks, the same corona shock, the same economic shocks, but the only difference between these two regions was the existence or non-existence of rent control. And we see that quite likely rent control affected housing starts negatively. So to summarize, we find that rent control led to a decrease in rental prices. However, after revocation of rent control, they increased again. We find no supply effects in terms of dwellings offered for sale, dwellings offered for rent, but in case of dwelling offered for sale, we find a big positive effect. So rent control led to a shift in the tenure of dwellings. And we see something reminding a negative effect on construction of this rent control policy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
And
right. Thank you, Konstantin, because I think that probably the information for most of us from Catalonia, those that are in the room, it is really interesting, and I do have a lot of questions, especially related to this expected reduction of housing supply by the end of your presentation, which I think that it's quite surprising, considering that in this particular period we are also talking about COVID and lockdown, and so, but it would be nice to talk a little bit more about that. But before I just express my concerns and doubts and questions, I would like to offer the floor to the audience. We have somebody with a microphone over there. So just please raise your hand. There we have Alex here. And then I cannot name everybody by its name.
Thanks.
Almost.
A question for Konstantin. In the synthetic control in the diff and diff, but you have considered using maybe Madrid as a control instead of the surrounding geographical areas around the rank control areas, and do you think that would have altered your results?
Yeah, indeed, this approach has been used, for example, for Germany, because in Germany you have more areas, or for rent freeze in Berlin. I think some people compared Berlin to other big cities. But I think we have still possibilities to do it within Catalonia. As I mentioned, actually, you can analyze the difference between, you can build a control group, for example, as dwellings located in controlled areas. So both control and treatment group dwellings are located in controlled municipalities, but the variation can be done across the size of dwellings. So 150 square meters as a threshold. That's more accurate, I think, because Madrid it's a big city. It's a big city in Spain, like Barcelona, but still it's located pretty far away, and it has its own peculiarities. So,
Cheers. Thanks.
Then we have another question over there.
Yeah, hello. Good morning. Gabo Heindl. I'm speaking tomorrow, and I was very happy that actually the Vienna model has been brought up a couple of times, and also rent control, which I can shorten tomorrow in my presentation. I just would like to remind us that in Vienna, and it was already said, in early Vienna, Red Vienna, the fact that there was heavy rent control actually made land prices drop, as you said, and also supply by the private markets. And in fact, now we just ended the session with kind of a negative effect of housing starts, meaning like supplying dropping. I'm just questioning how could we come to an understanding that this support of, let's say, this idea of supply that we are seeing, the private markets, to have that drop may not be the problem, or we could maybe reframe it. A, we have an ecological crisis, we don't want to build so much anymore. B, we have a crisis anyway in regulating. So what happened in Vienna, and I think that's the remarkable moment, that rather than giving out incentives to the market, after the market not building anymore, but using the fact that land prices dropped and actually building themselves. Now there we are we are not advocating anymore building to maybe so much today themselves, but how could we come to an understanding that this idea of supply that we've seen, degrees of that may not be the biggest problem, but maybe we change it in terms of, I'm just going to kind of link the three, trying to link the three presentations and see how we could have a change in thinking or a paradigm change there.
It's difficult to answer, but one of my questions was that maybe looking at rent control isolated from other policies, it's wrong. I totally understand your point, because that's what I feel, and I think that we have Christine here. Christine, the floor is yours, but I understand, yeah. Christine.
I think there is a real issue. I think it's amazing to do this work at this stage, and it's very helpful, but it can't be more than indicative. I think that if you look at any environment where such uncertainty is there, you will get response to uncertainty as much as response to the actual nature of a rent control in this context. But I think one of the points internationally, which is really important, is the capacity to shift between tenures. In the United States, you can't shift the buildings between tenures in the same way. And the same is true in a number of other countries. So when you can't shift them, then it takes longer for things to work out. But if you can shift them between them, then, especially in a rising market, people will do what we've seen here. I don't know that it would necessarily mean that if you look in 10 years' time, were it to have been in place for that long, you'll get the same results. But that's inherent, and I think it's really interesting.
Good. Thank you, Christine. We have another question here. I am trying to look for the microphone here. Julie? Yes. No, there is another one.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning and congratulations to the three speakers. I would like to introduce another element in the conversation because your presentations were really interesting, but you focus on the story of the rent control and on the possible effectiveness and examples. My point here is about the possibility of rent controls, taking into account the right to property. I mean, I would like to hear something, knowing about your ideas about the relationship between rent controls and right to property, because you have a macro perspective. I would like to have a micro perspective from the perspective of human rights. In that sense, in Europe, as we know, the European Convention of Human Rights recognizes the right to property. So, taking into account the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, the idea of proportionality and the idea of fair balance in relation to owners, what's your opinion about the possibility of introducing rent controls beyond the effectiveness or beyond the political discussion about that? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone? Anyone? Christine?
I think it's a very, very real issue about rights all the way around. But of course, national government and in countries with strong regional government do have the right to change the law in that way. And then if people want to appeal, they can appeal.
Any other comment from your side?
We're very fond of this particular organisation at the present time in England. So.
I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure if I understood you correctly. So probably you mean that the rent control goes against the right of property.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I'm asking the relationship between both elements. I'm
not
saying that it's I'm introducing the relationship between right to property and rent control. I'm not saying that it's against right to property, but there is a case law coming from the European Court of Human Rights, and there is a concept of proportionality and so on. So beyond effectiveness and beyond other technical aspects, 5 years without time, I mean, a solid foundation for rent control, in my opinion, should take into account this point. I mean, how to design rent control in order to not violate right to property and principle of proportionality. And in that sense, I was asking for your impressions. Thank you.
No, wait, we have another question over there. There was a question somewhere there. I saw the hand. Yeah, that far? Okay, that far.
Can I add a short
yes, of
comment
course.
on this?
Well, the microphone goes to the lady.
Speaking for the Italian case, in the Constitution, of course, we have the property rights well established, as they are more or less the base of national states also, as the property rights theories have explicited. But also, for example, in the Italian case, there is a social mandate to private property, which is embedded. So basically, private property is a right, but there's also a social obligation for private property. What it means then belongs to political discussion and legislations, but you could argue that basically you have two conflicting arguments, no? Of course, in some cases, as in the case of gentrification, you have clearly the two conflicting arguments, and the balance is highly political. That is not well.
Just to complement, I mean, looking into the long history of rent control, we see that even if you have in your constitution or whatever this provision for private property, as soon as the situation becomes difficult enough, everybody forgets about this, except landlords probably. And the rent control laws are introduced, and they remain in place for decades, although it might be violating or might be against the rights of certain groups of population. So the public necessity, the social necessity prevails prevailed in the history.
We have the question over there. Yes?
Yeah, Ala Koplikova, Nottingham Trent University. My concern is separation of the effects not only within the different policies like rent control or anything else, but also some regional effects. Is there any specific regional effect in Catalonia or in Barcelona possibly, like we have, for example, in the UK, south of England, very specific effects? If not, then at least just to mention or to make an attempt to separate those effects. You know, it might be something specifically regional, and this is a response, regional response, rather than policy effects. Thank you.
Yeah, surely you may have regional effects, but I recently did an overview of empirical literature on effects of rent control, which includes more than 100 different studies, did in different regions, different periods, and for example, what concerns the housing construction, they're not unanimous. There are many more studies that are saying that rent control will decrease the new construction, and there are a few studies that say that it will not affect it. And to a certain extent, these differences in results are due to regional differences. To a certain extent, they are due to the differences in the design of rent control, because you know, first generation, second generation of rent control, mixture of these two generations. Sometimes people are talking about third generation. So there are different incentives, different designs, and they can also affect probably more than the regional specificities. They can affect the impact of rent control on prices, construction, home ownership, and so on and so forth. Quality of housing, too.
I think the problem we've got here, in some sense, is that it's a timing issue. I mean, obviously, if things are uncertain, a lot of people decide that they won't do something for a little while. The fact that you don't get any supply response is really interesting.
It's very interesting. Absolutely. We have a question here, and then I will come to you. Then, and Adriana.
First of all, thanks a lot for the panel. It's an extremely interesting discussion, and I feel like almost privileged to be here. This being said, a couple of remarks. It is very interesting that your study, Konstantin, states that even when supply goes up in home ownership, in sale market, prices, they don't go down. You have shown us that after the lift of the rent control in Catalonia, the supply went up, especially in the surrounding neighborhoods, not only in the controlled areas, and that increase in supply, it was accompanied by an increase in price. And this is relevant, at least here in Spain, for our domestic debate, because what we call supply believers, they state that the problem is very simple to solve. No matter what the problem is, if you increase the supply, the prices will moderate and accessibility will be better. So in that regard, your study is extremely interesting, because we can continue the debate here at Catalan and Spanish level in order to see if the increase in supply by itself, I'm not saying that increasing the supply is not good, by itself, it solves all the problems. And connected to this, you just said that the difference between Madrid and Catalonia after the declaration of inconstitutionality of the law, of the rent control law here in Catalonia, and after the more severe period of the corona, they were not relevant. They were comparable. And you have shown us a better performance in terms of construction of Madrid than Barcelona and Catalonia. That will be like that for years for one reason, because there is another set of circumstances that they have to do with town planning, affordable housing regulation, all different types of legal obligations that, to put it in a graphic scheme, is like the following. Barcelona is trying to mutate from the Milan model to the Vienna model. So regulations, they are more strict in order to what promoters and developers can do within the city. And Madrid is mutating to a model of almost no public intervention. So in that framework, quantity is important. I'm not diminishing the importance of quantity, but quality, what type of supply you have, at what prices, for what type of users, is extremely relevant. So I would say that for this type of empirical studies, which are extremely interesting, it will be interesting to introduce in the future in the production of new homes, how many of those are, in our case, vivienda protegida, which is our type of subsidized housing, how many of them are market units, how many of them are for rental, and how many of them are for sale, and to be able to monitor the prices and the users.
Any reaction from the panel? Christine, Konstantin?
I think that we're, inherently, this was a 2-year exercise. It was very well known to everybody that it was likely to change. I think that it's very difficult to grow. It's important to look at it. But I mean, the fundamental of this, if we're talking about a 10-year period and trying to house people, is that demand varies much more than supply. And new build doesn't really make much difference to the price of housing overall, unless we're absolutely convinced that we can go on producing at particular levels for a long time. So I don't want to overinterpret what are interesting but inherently partial things. We haven't looked at the overall market in any real sense.
Yeah. Plus.
Yes.
And we can't. It's not a criticism. It's just the honest answer is these policies are going to have to survive for a very long time. And Vienna is the obvious example of a very different world in which things did stay adequately stable for a very long time, and outcomes can be seen very clearly. Which is why we all look at Vienna.
Just one clarification. So in the first table where the price and quantity effects were shown, it was not that supply increased, it was just the redistribution of supply from housing for rent to housing for sale. Yes, so the housing stock remained the same.
Yeah, and which is what you would exactly expect, because that's in your country as in mine, but not in Germany's and Denmark's. It's very easy to make that shift.
Yeah, and the actual housing supply, the size of housing stock was, well, I'm not saying declining, but well, maybe declining if there are less housing, well, not declining, but at least
stable.
Yeah, lowering the growth of housing stock, but lowering due to less housing starts. So
we have another question. Let's take 5 minutes from the coffee. We started a bit late. Yes, please.
Thank you. It's also a quick question related to the Catalan study. I was wondering about your argument about the tenure conversion from supply of rental to more supply of sales. Because if you say that the supply of rentals didn't decrease and the supply of sales did increase, why do you say landlords stopped renting and instead chose to sell? Yeah. Because this new supply could come from empty housing, from Airbnbs, from new build. So why do you interpret it as landlords decided to stop renting and to sell instead.
Yeah, you're perfectly right. There are, of course, different factors at play, and what you said about Airbnb, it's also true. You observe it in many European cities that there was switch from Airbnb to longer-term rental contracts. It's a kind of speculation. That's the fact that we actually observe, and the literature, empirical literature, shows us that at least part of this decline can be due to the switch in the supply of rental, from supply of rental to supply of dwellings for sale.
Last question, João.
Thank you. I'm João from Lisbon. Congratulations to the panel. It was a wonderful presentations. As you know, in Lisbon and in Portugal, we had this rent control system for over 40 years, and the consequences were exactly as described in the conclusions of Christine Whitehead. We have now, and we took almost 60 years to phase out this rent control system. I would say that for what I see, the study of Constantine supports also the conclusions of Christine, even if it's a very small period compared to the long period that Christine said. And I wouldn't say for this experience of ourselves that it's not a surprise that rent increase just after the end of the law, and that the sales also increase, so that there's a change of tenures in the market, because of course landlords are very averse to uncertainty, and of course they want to secure their wealth. My question, I don't know if it's possible to answer for you now, but it's if you both think, or the three of you think, that rent control is set by governments, when this government or the states are not investing enough in public affordable houses. So if there is any relation with this, because when this, my opinion, if the states invest more and have more position in regulating the market, so like in Vienna do, there is less necessity to put a rent control on the market.
Thank you, João. The panel, any reaction to that? Is there any relationship in between not investing on social housing and controlling? Christine?
Well, there is a relationship in the sense that, if you have rent control and you don't have some other means of producing affordable housing, then over the long term, the situation will be significantly worse, particularly for lower, even though the rent control is impacting, the changes like transfer into owner occupation, etc., will take place. When we were able to run rent control for a significant rent control, I mean, a lot of rent control just has no effect anyway, because it's not implemented or it's not particularly realistic. But if it is having an effect, then you've got to have an alternative supply. Otherwise, the world is worse.
Yeah.
Well, I can confirm it. I mean, from history of rent control, we see that rent control often leads to necessity of public construction. So first, the shortage of housing comes, then people try to solve it using rent control in the expectation that soon private construction will enter the market and will, in the long run, will fill the gap between supply and demand. But it's not a fact, because nobody is interested in this, and so the government is forced to invest money in constructing social housing or public housing. But the thing is that why it's not used often by the government, I think it's the question, for me, it's the simple answer, maybe it's a cynical answer, it's money. If the government wants to construct something, it must spend billions of euros a year. If it wants to introduce rent control, it costs nothing, just the paper on which the law is printed. Because it's up to tenants to survey whether the law is fulfilled or not. And the government has virtually no expenses. And at the same time, it can say, okay, I did everything you wanted, I protected you, now you're protected, that's fine.
It's just the other people who aren't. the outsiders are not protected.
So I think that we are opening another melon here. So shall we close it? Because otherwise we are going to miss the coffee. Thank you all for your patience, and thank you all for your presence here.
Thank you.
And so just to tell you something, that the private sector is definitely something in the eye of many politicians, activists, people. Tomorrow, we will have another plenary on the private rented sector, but from another completely different perspective. But now we have Nuria to end our session properly.
Thank you. Thanks, Christine, Marco, Constantine, and Montse for these really interesting thoughts on rent control and its scope, nuances, and effectiveness. I know it's not scientific research nor big data, nor as important as your presentations, which were amazing, but I have empirical proof. I have a small, tiny, personal empirical experience and result, because it is thanks to the Catalan rent control measure that I can still live in my neighborhood, actually, which is a really popular and a speculated and gentrificated neighborhood. So I guess I'm a living proof, I could say, that these measures can have a positive impact to allow us to live in the places we belong to, and therefore also preserve a neighborhood's identity, cultural and social networks, which I think it's the essence of all our cities. So thank you all so much for being here, and also for the field trips that you have organized, which will for sure enrich these debates. And let's take a coffee break. Today it's sunny, so you can take the coffee outside, and let's meet in the classrooms again at 11:45. Thank you all so much.